I'm David Fischer, and it's a great pleasure to be here to celebrate the Centennial of the Extension School. Some of the happiest teaching I've done has been as a visitor in the courses in the Extension School, and what a joy it is to teach mature students who teach their teachers. And it's a very happy occasion to be here. We're invited to speak about our own work, and I'll do that, but first, a few thoughts about all of us together. We historians are the most eclectic of academic disciplines, and that diversity is, I think, one of its great strengths and maybe our saving grace. We are all riders on a rising wave. For all the talk, the apocalyptic talk about things getting worse and worse, for history, a good many things are getting better. The American Historical Association studies the trends and collects the numbers. I was surprised to see that today, if we look at history concentrators, at history degrees, history enrollments, we find the numbers are at a 30-year high. And that took me very much by surprise. Also, I find that much of the growth is outside of the history departments that go into those measurements. I can no longer tell what department a history book is coming from. So many of us in so many different disciplines are moving on converging lines as people are discovering that history is not only a field in itself, but it's a method of inquiry in many other fields. There are some qualitative straws in the wind as well. Last month I was in San Diego, as many of us were, interviewing job candidates. And flying back to Boston with colleagues in other universities, we all agreed that the quality of the candidates had never been higher in talent, in scholarship, in creativity. The sad part is that the jobs had rarely been tighter. And there are many people who were chasing fewer positions. We've had a very sharp decline that way this past year, but it's a decline on the rising line. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Another hopeful sign is something we could never know from the media. Some extraordinary things are happening today in history teaching in the primary and secondary schools. For all the gloom and doom on that subject, there are some astounding lines of progress. We had a conference of early American historians just recently here in Boston, and the first session was devoted to work of high school teachers in New England. And most of the university people there in the conference thought that that was the most creative part of the entire gathering. And these experiments are going on, often unheralded and unnoticed, but with increasing momentum. And then something else began to happen. I'm not quite sure when. Was it in the 80s, perhaps? I've never seen the numbers on this, but quite a number of us were amazed to discover that people were actually reading our books. And that took us very much by surprise. I'm finding that they're not only reading our books, but they're writing the authors. And there's a new quality of interaction about that. That is, the digital revolution that we've been asked to reflect upon today has changed everything in various ways. It's changed the relationship that a scholar has with these materials. It changes the relationship between an author and his text. But it also changes the relationship between a person publishing a work and his readers. And these people write to me, and as the emails come streaming in, they have no trouble finding where we are and what our addresses might be. We can begin to learn quite a lot about them, and I think it's a new public for history. These are literate people. They are affluent. They buy books and CDs and downloads. We can know from the algorithms on Amazon what time they go to bed at night and when they get up in the morning. Many of them are people in mid-career. They never, I think the greatest proportion of them never majored in history, and they discovered it later in life. I think many of them discovered that history was happening to them, and they began to turn to read about it in that way. Many of them, they're as diverse as the historians themselves are, even more so. But they come to it in many different ways. I think the largest proportion of them, one might say, are in the knowledge business. They're in the old professions or the new digital disciplines. They work with rigor and complexity all their days. And they bring that sense of high seriousness to their reading of history. And they've not been well served in the past, either by what is often called popular history or by what is called academic history. They don't want their history to be dumbed down. And they complain about that when they think it's happening. They don't want to be condescended to. They also have no interest in historiography. They think that that's the shadow of the thing and not the thing itself. And they want to read history when they go in that direction. And the question is how to reach this public, and it's very large. There are millions of these people in America, and increasingly they are around the world, and they went global before the historians did. And to my astonishment, my publishers are translating Washington's Crossing into Serbo-Croatian, and that we found a 2-volume edition of Washington's Crossing in China, which my publishers did not know about. And that also is spreading at a rapid rate around the world. So how to reach this very diverse group is what I have been studying and trying to achieve in my work. And I took a kind of my point of departure came from the historiography that I had been trained to do first, starting out 50 years ago as a political historian. And then a generation after that, joining in that wonderful movement for the new social and cultural history, a sense that older political history had been very strong in some ways. It had wonderful narrative lines, but it was too constraining. It was too, and also it lacked a kind of rigor that so many of our readers are looking for. And the new history broadened things. We've heard about the inclusion. It was more than that. It was also that new sense of structure and process. And that was a very exciting moment to be part of that process. And yet there was a problem there. We talked about, in the Annals way, a histoire totale. It was to be the history of everybody, doing everything, everywhere. And the only way we could get our hands around that was by writing monographs in which often nobody was actually mentioned by name. And the result was that as the subject got larger, the public got smaller for those sorts of books. And then I looked back over my shoulder to the history that we had done in politics. And the irony is that when we were writing about small elites, we reached a much larger public. And so the question was, could we combine the strengths of both of those approaches? It is certainly possible, and I think maybe in some moments I've achieved a kind of synthesis in which we've combined the weaknesses of both of those fields. But I think if we can bring those things together, there's a power of fusion here that reaches and speaks to the condition of a great many people. It can have that breadth and inclusion of social and cultural history at its best. But it can also have the drama and the narrative tension of the old history of events and leaders. And then other things were changing. We were troubled, a good many of us, by the growing determinism of the new social and cultural history. And in the 80s, quite a number of us began to look for another way to get past that. And one person who did that was my colleague, James McPherson, in his work on the Civil War that many of you will know. And he wrote that wonderful book called Battle Cry of Freedom, around an idea of turning points, when things really hung in the balance. And he called those moments of contingency. And at the same time he was doing that, just here on Oxford Street, Stephen Jay Gould was remodeling the history of evolution. And he went into the Burgess Shale fossils in British Columbia, and he found extraordinary things that told him that the history of evolution had moved not in a kind of seamless way, but in fits and starts, accidents, genetic accidents. And he called those accidents contingency. And he wrote that book called Wonderful Life, took the title from the Jimmy Stewart movie. And it was another way into that. And then I got into this act with my book on Paul Revere. And my book was about people making choices, and choices making a difference in the world. Not just leaders, or not leaders in the sense of people who are members of a small elite, but a very broad web of choice. And I called that contingency, people making choices. But when it was a web of choices, the web introduced structure and process. And so it became a mediating idea. And that's what is going on in my book called Paul Revere's Ride. Another thing that I thought was interesting and that people have responded to was to do much of this in the way of the study of values. That is, it was not only people making choices, but the values that they had in mind when they did that. And that got me into the study of values as vernacular things, not in textbooks and treatises, but much more complex structures of value. Liberty and freedom in America, humanity in New France. I've just finished a book on fairness in New Zealand about these vernacular ideas. And then the question was how to tell stories when we're transacting all that business. And that got me into an idea of what I began to call braided narratives, putting these various strands together. Also inviting people to get into the business of inquiry into these things. These are people who want to think for themselves. And so often I begin, as many here have done, with visual materials, inviting my readers to look at a piece of visual evidence, and then engaging them in an inquiry, braiding the inquiring process into the story that we're telling. And one other part of this is what Donald Yerxa calls primary synthesis. We now have the digital tools that we have greatly extended our reach. I don't think they've tightened their grasp, but we have longer reaches. And as we do into that material, we can work with primary sources to build these larger frames within which our stories take place. And when I do that, I think the mail begins to come in. Thank you very much.